Good evening, everyone. I hope you all are doing well and keeping safe during this time. Welcome, Selma and Bruno.
Hi,
Thank
Marley.
you.
How are
It's
you guys doing?
warmer than
De-
last week.
It is.
Definitely. It's not
It is.
warm, but it's definitely warmer. Welcome to another Wednesday webinar with the Property Law Alliance. And then I'm going to start off with the question that we received on our page. So I'm just going to read it to you guys, and then we can maybe break it down, if that is good with you. All right. So we received a question from Lisa saying that my tenants from beginning of lockdown sent an email saying that they can only afford to pay half the rent till the end of the year. We informed them that we have to use their deposit to cover for the shortfall and losses of income and will re-evaluate their contract before deposit runs out. They only paid 1 month's deposit, so their deposit won't carry them till the end of their contract or until the end of this year. We cannot afford to let them stay in our house with only paying half the rent. And then the first question, can we tell our tenants that their contract has now ended because their deposit is finished and that they can't afford the rent till the end of this year? And then secondly, lockdown 3 allows for moving. So can we tell them to move out? And then the last question, if so, must we give them a month to month or 2 months to move out? All right, so I think we can start at with the first question. Can we tell our tenants that their contract has now ended because their deposit is finished and that they can't afford the rent till the end of this year? Silna, I don't know if you want to take this one.
Probably because I pulled my face that funny. I realized afterwards I should never pull my face like that. But my face is usually the answer. You don't really need much more than just my facial expressions to get answers out of me. And I must say, Marilee, the problem I'm having with the question, Bruno, and I think you'll agree with me here, is there's a lot of information that we need that we don't have in the question. So I'm going to make a few predictions and I will tell you what I'm basing my answers on. So to say that a contract ended because a deposit ran out, that's not part of lease agreements and the law and the way that works. So definitely, because the deposit's been utilized, it can't be a reason for cancellation of the agreement. So if we look at that fact sheet, I think one of the most important things is the agreement between the parties. So I get that the landlord allowed the tenant to utilize the deposit for a certain period of time. I would hope that that agreement was reduced to writing. The only problem is I suspect that it wasn't. And the reason why that's my suspicion is if the agreement was reduced to writing, and it was typically done on, say, for instance, the TPN rent recovery documentation that allows for these things, cancellation and repayment and how it would work would be dealt with in the agreement. So my concern is that this was a verbal agreement. So my problem with a verbal agreement in that regard is not just that it's a verbal agreement and now it's difficult to say what the parties agree to. My bigger problem is if it was a verbal agreement and the lease agreement was in writing and the lease agreement doesn't allow for amendment of the agreement unless it's reduced to writing and signed by both parties, that entire story is now up in the air because it could very well not be an enforceable agreement between the parties. The deposit was utilized not in the way it should have been done in terms of the lease agreement. So I'm a little concerned about that. But the simple answer to that first question is no, you can't cancel an agreement because the deposit has been utilized. A deposit can only be utilized in terms of the lease agreement. And by the time you utilize the deposit, it's either done by agreement between the parties or it's done because the lease agreement has come to an end. So that's sort of the options. So definitely, you're not allowed to cancel the agreement because the deposit ran out, but unfortunately, at this stage, we sit with a tenant that's now not paying rent. And since we do not know what the terms of the agreement is between the landlord and the tenant, I do believe that the tenant could very well now be in breach. But that's the second part of the question. Bruno, do you want to add anything to that first part of the question on cancelling because the deposit ran out?
No, not at all. I think, yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's a very unusual situation. You rarely deal with it in practice, that is. And now, obviously, with the use of deposits during COVID, most of the time we do expect or rely on actual written agreements to govern, to govern the practice or to govern how the deposit is actually dealt with. So, insofar as common law is concerned or case law is concerned, there would probably be very few examples that we could actually rely on for a very direct answer.
That's what I'm thinking.
Okay. All right, perfect. So it depends on a lot of factors. And
What's
then
the
I just
second,
want,
what's the second part of those questions? Because I think there's
it's,
actually quite a lot there.
yes, the second one is lockdown 3 allows for moving. So can we tell them to move out? And then the other, the second part of it is, if so, must we give them a month to move or 2 months notice to move out? So
Sorry, do you
still
mind
not.
just repeating the first part? I completely missed it. I was just doing something else quickly. Do you mind?
It says lockdown 3 allows for moving. So can we tell them to move out? And then if so, must we give them a month to move or 2 months notice to move out? All right. So Bruno, I don't know if you want to take this one.
So again, it goes back to what we discussed initially. The terms of the contract would be indicative of what we can actually do. So as far as I'm concerned, if it's a month-to-month lease agreement, you can give them 1 month notice to move out. And so far as the application of level 3 regulations are concerned, we've discussed it before. People are allowed to move. People are allowed to, initiate new lease agreements, move into new places. So that's fortunately no longer in contest. So now, is the landlord entitled to ask them to vacate? Absolutely. What time frames are we looking at? Lease agreement, 1 month notice, if we're not referring to breaches. If it's a month-to-month contract. If, for example, it's a breach and you can justify giving notice, then you do need to give the 20 days business notice under most circumstances. There are certain exceptions, but the majority of the time with residential leases, you lease to an actual individual. So 20 days business notice with cancellation. And then after the cancellation, they're actually supposed to move out immediately. So you're generally looking always at a 1 month period. Unless for some reason your contract is 2 months by 2 months, in which case then, yeah, 2 months notice if there's no breach.
Okay. Perfect.
But I think, yeah, Marilee, I just want to add, to clarify, actually, it's not add, it's echo. Because the question sort of seems like it's a mid-term agreement. So it feels like it's a fixed term agreement. And the question relates to how much notice can you give a tenant to cancel a fixed term agreement. So what Bruno is saying is if there's no breach of the agreement, for instance, there was an agreement that they can utilize the deposit. The idea was that this can carry on for quite some time. Then you can't cancel that agreement because the tenant is not in breach. If the deposit was utilized sort of without having it reduced to writing, especially if there's a non-variation clause in that lease agreement that says agreements has to be amended in writing, it could very well mean that this landlord is unfortunately stuck in a situation where they're going to have to prove the terms of the agreement to utilize the deposit, and you're not going to give any amount of time notice to cancel, because you will have to face you will have to take the correct steps in law to get to cancellation. But there's as long as the CPA applies, and as long as there's no specific provision in the lease agreement for cancellation, you won't be able to just randomly cancel regardless of the amount of time that you're giving. But like Bruno explained, the month-to-month agreements very well.
Okay, perfect. I think that covers majority of the possible scenarios. And then I just want to ask, is there anything new happening in the property industry, especially following the president's address during last week? Anything new happening?
Maybe I just thought of something though, and it goes back to what someone was saying. So if you don't mind, if I take a step back, I think maybe for the viewer's sake, the way that the questions are posed could maybe have not complicated, but result in a bit of confusion, as, like especially in the way that we answered it. So let's maybe put the questions together and look at it holistically now. More than likely, what is the actual scenario that played out here? Because we have to make a lot of assumptions, but as attorneys, we're also quite experienced on more than likely what has actually happened. And the reality is this is probably a phone call or an email or something where somebody said, I can't afford to pay. Tell you what, I'll pay half. I'll pay as much as possible, probably half, use the deposit to cover the other half, right? So you're dealing with situations like that. Now, the landlord's reaction is where the variables start kicking in. So the landlord's agreement to this scenario, but more than likely, if a landlord has accepted that the deposit would be utilized, it's almost implied that it can only be utilized up to the point where the deposit actually exists. Beyond that point, there is no deposit to apply. So I would almost assume that if one were to rely on some kind of oral agreement or some indulgence of use of the deposit, the reality is the deposit can only last so long. And after that point, there has to be a revisitation. But our law is quite funny when it comes to revisiting terms of contracts, because it's not something that's enforceable, because you can't force parties to negotiate with each other. So you generally tend to apply the contract in the most sensible form. And in this particular instance, the reality is it's a month-to-month lease agreement. A certain amount of rental would be due each and every month. A statement of non-affordability kicked in, almost a consent of use of deposit kicked in. But now we're back at a point where we need to replenish the deposit. That could be a hard one to enforce. But insofar as the receipt of rent is concerned, I'm almost not, I can't say 100% confident, but I'm quite confident that any failure from this point onwards to pay rent would constitute a breach. I don't know if you agree with me, Silna.
No, 100%, 100%. And I think to your point, Bruno, because there's so many open-ended things that we're talking about, the answer is always, if a tenant is in breach of the agreement, definitely you can place him on terms. If he doesn't remedy, you can cancel. And I think the problem that you have is if you start contracting outside of the contract in separate things, your proof of breach could become difficult. And the reason why, as attorneys, we are paranoid about the factual breach being in dispute is if there's a verbal agreement or some or the other thing outside of the contract that we can't prove on a simple piece of paper, that means we need to lead oral evidence in court to prove the terms of that agreement. And why we are so paranoid about that is there are two different processes that you can follow. Action, which starts with a summons, and you use that when you have a factual dispute, which you need to clarify with oral evidence. Or motion proceedings, where you start with an application, it's a much quicker process, and that's how we want to do evictions. So the moment we need to start proving that the tenant is in fact in breach, and we can't do that on paper, we get nervous, not because it can't be done, we can definitely get those evictions done. Problem is, it's instead of a 2-3 months process, now suddenly if you're in the wrong court, you can end up in an 18 months to 2-year process.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think part of the this particular question, I saw one of the answers that somebody gave again made reference to we are not allowed to do evictions during lockdown. And Bruno, I don't know about you, but I think we've had this conversation like a million times in the past 3 months. But I love it. We can do it again. But I think just for the benefit of the viewers, guys, seriously, we are evicting. Bruno, I don't know about you, but we've been busier than ever before. There's a lot of evictions happening, and our evictions are getting issued. Our dates are unfortunately a little slower than normal, but it's really, we're evicting. There is nothing in the regulations that prohibits us from doing evictions. I just wanted to throw that one in quickly, just to clarify that point. Now you can say, now you can add 2 more sentences, Bruno, and then Marilee will give it back to you.
No, it's no problem.
No, I'm good. That's pretty much it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was a good,
Yeah.
clear clarification. I'm glad you said that, because we've made like a million assumptions, and I think we needed to just tie it together again.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes, definitely. All right, thank you guys. And then if we can go on to if there's anything new happening, especially following the president's address during last week. And I know that there's a lot of questions regarding Airbnb. So I don't know if you maybe, Bruno, want to get started on that.
Yeah.
I know it's a very general question, but
Yeah, no. But it's quite it's quite specific, especially to the worry now that a lot of my clients and property investors in general, which is all of our clients, are fearing, is the address almost seemed to isolate Airbnb to a certain degree insofar as property is concerned. Obviously, the address was quite broad, but when it came to the property sector and hotels reopening, and then there was a very specific jab at Airbnb. And I'm not saying it's intentional, naturally not. I just think it's a label, and the use of this label is what, sorry, give me a second. I'm going to share the regulations, just so I've got that open. So the use of the label when it comes to short-term home sharing, letting, leasing, rental for leisure purposes. So this was what the president was referring to during the address, saying that hotels and the rest are going to start getting opened, but when it comes to home sharing, he's going to hold back, and that probably won't be permitted. And then he added saying that like Airbnb. But what I also noticed is, or what we need to bear in mind is, I don't feel that we're going to have a move backwards where things are going to become more restrictive. And I certainly don't see the regulations mentioning Airbnb by name. So President might have done it, but President just did it because he was almost having a conversation and trying to bring context to what he was trying to say. When the regulations come out, they are not going to isolate specific businesses. So Airbnb is safe from that perspective. It's not like they're banned as a business. And if they were, that is very unconstitutional. So that would not pass any sort of muster at all. So now we're looking at what the president's intention was, which I feel is to say that in terms of the specific exclusions, number 3 is probably something that he's going to hang on to. But if you read number 3, and this is obviously speculation, but the reason why, as Silna normally says, she doesn't like to speculate when there aren't regulations or legislation in place. And I totally agree with that. The only problem is, because of the way that we're bouncing from regulation to regulation, people's short-term planning, I'm getting a lot of concern that this is going to be an issue. So all I'm really trying to do here is say, if I were to speculate and assume what's going to come out of this, I'm going to imagine that this particular paragraph is going to stay. So short-term home sharing, letting, leasing, rental for leisure purposes. And we're already in a position now where very few things are being done that are actually leisure-based. So as far as I'm concerned, if it does retain this, Airbnb would still probably be able to operate within the commercial space, or rather the business space. So at least that would still be intact. Then we'd also need to look at things like home sharing and maybe start considering what home sharing actually means. And I know that Silna, when we started this conversation, you had actually specifically mentioned home sharing. I don't know if you want to touch on that a little bit.
Yes, so I just almost killed myself with my earphones. That would have been so dramatic. But Bruno, I just want to clarify the regulations that we have on screen now. That is the lockdown level 3 regulations, because we don't have the new regulations yet, the amended regulations, right? So I agree with you 100%. And I had a conversation with one of my clients as well, who's an Airbnb client. And she said to me, oh my goodness, Silna, what is this now? Because I have people in shared rentals, and it's been like that even before lockdown. What now? Am I going to have to kick off them out? What is that going to be like? And I don't think, I know that's not a concern. The issue is we don't want to do, and now I'm going to use the term Airbnb. Look at me pulling a move like the president now. For instance, Airbnb, where you have multiple people renting one place at different times, and they share places like kitchens, living room areas, things like that. If you want to spread a virus, that's the perfect place to do it. And we don't want to spread a virus. So that's why home sharing is off the cards. But if people are already sharing a property, so let's talk about commune setups, especially with students coming back, universities opening, schools opening, things like that. Your communes that people have been occupying already during lockdown, if they've been away and they've returned in lockdown level 3, you're not going to have to evict one of them. They have already been living together. What the regulations are aiming to do is to not have like a typical multi-let situation where people are doing short-term rentals. And the reason why the short-term is relevant is where you live, you're definitely going to leave virus behind. If you do have the virus, you will leave, obviously, you exposing everybody coming in and out of that property. You are exposing them to a risk, and this is the reason why short-term rentals are off the cards, and especially short-term leisure rentals, because the truth is there's been a lot of people using Airbnbs for business travel lately. I personally am a Airbnb business traveler as well. Haven't been traveling for business since February. I'm actually currently busy with the Law Society seminar, but I must tell you, Bruno, it's sort of heartbreaking in a way. I'm so used to seeing the other attorneys throughout the country on an annual basis, and now I have to tell them, like, please just turn your video cameras on so I can see there are actually people. So it's sad that I haven't been traveling, but I can understand how short-term leisure travel increases the risk even more. Business, to be quite frank, I still believe that as an Airbnb host, you do have an increased obligation now to sterilize a place once somebody's been there, because the last thing you want to do is to have to call somebody back and say, hi, so by the way, maybe you want to get tested because the person that left before you tested positive. So it's an increased obligation on Airbnb hosts, short-term rental hosts. But I think that the main thing is home sharing. Nobody's going to have to evict anybody right now. Everybody can stay like that, but we don't want people moving in and out of spaces where they live together and potentially expose each other to a risk.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, so from my client's perspective, the particular concern isn't necessarily just the home sharing, but like the actual short-term letting. But that's, so from my side, in my particular case with the client, the main focus at the moment was the leisure purposes, because we did feel that this kind of provides that safety net, because at the moment there's very little that you can actually do for leisure. So from our side, short-term letting is still a bit touchy, but the leisure purposes kind of still allows Airbnb to function as they normally would, or as they normally should. And remember, if I'm not mistaken, the regulations also provide for accommodation specific to isolation and self-quarantine. And that's actually something exclusive of this particular table. So if arrangements are made where someone needs to self-quarantine for 14 days, that is also permitted. So I know that some Airbnb hosts have set it up as such, where they're happy to provide the service. So that also isn't really impacted by this.
Yeah, and I think that's such a brilliant way of changing the way we do rentals. I've also multi-let clients from my side that I've seen where people are moving out. They want to bring new people in. I must say, I'm a little reluctant to say go wild, move people in and out, even if it's not a short-term rental, say it is a 6 months or 1 year agreement. I do still suggest to my clients to make sure that when they do that, that the people in the premises are aware of that, that there is somebody new coming in, so everybody can still keep can be a little more safe, because in fairness, when you are at home, when I'm in my kitchen at home, it's a very different way. I treat the space very differently as I do, for instance, in the office. This is the first Wednesday webinar, guys, which I'm doing from my office. How cool is that? Back in my office. Marilee, it's cool to be in the same office as you for this. But for instance, the office kitchen, I am absolutely paranoid because everybody is touching the same kitchen door. Everybody is touching the cupboards. I walk around with a spray bottle of my poor kitchen is like an alcoholic by now. Where at home, I mean, you wash your hands and change your clothes when you get home, and then from there, life is pretty. You know, I honestly don't spray alcohol all over my house. Where you have a shared letting situation, a home sharing, especially where you share kitchens, living areas, to move a new person in there, definitely not disallowed by the regulations. For short-term rentals, yes, disallowed, but you are allowed to do that. But for the landlords, I think I just want to add a little extra caution. Remember, guys, as much as the regulations allow for this, at the same time, you have a responsibility towards your tenants to ensure their undisturbed use and enjoyment of the premises. And at the same time, the moment you move another person into their space, that could limit their use and enjoyment of the premises, I would like to see a notice to say a new person is coming in, he's been in self-isolation, or he's been in quarantine, or whatever the case might be, and it is safe for you to do this, just so everybody knows what's happening in the particular premises, and everybody can take the responsibility to keep themselves as safe as possible.
It's actually interesting. You drew the analogy between your workplace and the multi-tenanted residences. And I think we've had this discussion before, but right at the beginning when we were worried about people moving around. And so now the discussions we've been having with our multi-tenanted landlords is maybe consider treating it like a workplace, because there's no right or wrong. And like you said, you're allowed to do whatever you want, but not whatever you want, but within the regulations, you're allowed to bring in a new tenant. Now, the problem is that no provision is made restricting this. And then we start looking at our law to say, well, what responsibility would the landlord have to his tenant? In terms of derelict, for example, or in the contract, whether it's implied, maybe there's a safety element to it that we've never had to explore, but now all of a sudden it's there because the landlord has a certain power that the tenant doesn't. So the landlord can now throw as many people as he wants into that property. What can a tenant do about it? Does he have a right to cancel the lease? Does he have a right to object? Does he have a right to complain or lay a criminal charge? What are those rights? So it's a type of area that we don't actually know really well, because the contracts don't expressly provide for it. We don't know tacitly whether we could rely on an expected term that's not in the contract, but one would expect it to be, whether it's a duty that also we're not really aware of. So as far as I'm concerned, from the landlord's perspective, is don't put yourself in that situation, because it can only land you in hot water. So rather be open, transparent. People know that when they move into a multi-tenanted residence, that there's going to be other tenants. So I think there the landlord would be safe. But now the landlord stepped in making sure that his current tenants are safe. Why not follow a protocol very similar to the workplace protocol, where you have people testing themselves or screening themselves, where you have certain disclosures? I'd even go so far as to say, create house rules, or create an internal agreement between the tenants where they opt in to behaving in a certain way. So the landlord in those instances can even take a step back and go, great, it's being dealt with, where the tenants actually agree amongst each other. This is what we expect. The food in the fridge will be dealt with. So now we already have that. But you know what? It doesn't matter because somebody eats your cheese, you just get a bit angry. No, it's serious, right?
It's cheese,
Got a
Bruno.
lot angry.
It's cheese. Do not, you can take anything, but do not, I am Dutch. Do not mess with cheese.
Fine. So something
Your
else.
example was clearly on point.
But now obviously the danger of it is something that we're worried about. So having those internal agreements where you've got protocols, and it's not difficult protocols, tenants walk in. So think about workplace protocols. There's a level of screening. There, you make sure that there's sanitizers all over the place. I'd go so far as to say, listen, landlord, please, when you're bringing somebody new in, just re-sanitize the common areas, not the individual rooms. So sanitize the room that's empty, that you're probably going to have to do anyway, and the common areas. Let the tenant come in, let him know who else is there. Let them have a certain set of house rules that dictate how they need to interact with each other, and have protocols in place that if they breach those protocols, they're actually in breach of the agreement. And then you can act. And at least as a landlord, you've kind of taken that obligation off your shoulders of worry and actually handed it over. Because now if they breach, you send the cancellation notices, you do whatever you can, but you can only do so much in terms of the law. But at least you're in a position to do something if they start breaching. So start approaching it like a workplace, and I think you'll be on the safe side. The safe side of things.
I agree with you, Bruno. I like your suggestion about the house rules, because remember, the Rental Housing Act, in any event, makes reference to house rules on multi-let. And the truth is, the Rental Housing Act actually wants to see house rules on multi-lets. And so even for the landlord that doesn't have house rules yet, now is the moment to bring it in and say, listen, this is how we deal with COVID, and more importantly, the cheese in the fridge. It's important things that people need to deal with. And sanitizing, we all know that schools reopening, some of the grades are already back, and I must say I'm very impressed to see how the schools adopted sanitizing, because you can actually do it in a pretty cost-effective way, where they sanitize pretty much permanently. Like before the kids come in the morning, they sanitize. When the kids go out for break time, they sanitize the place, and then in the afternoon they sanitize. And it can be done in a cost-effective way, but I agree with you, Bruno. We can't be in a position where a landlord has to be like right there the whole time, checking on the tenant, like calling the tenant 5 times a day. Hello, did you wash your hands? What's happening there? Are you where there are very specific rules, and the other tenants must know that they can complain, and then the landlord has an obligation to act against the tenant that doesn't comply with the house rules. I think that's a very important part of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. We do have a question, a few questions in our comment section. I just want to ask a specific one that relates to the sanitation of a property. So she's asking, is the owner obligated to a deep clean professional sanitation of a property if a contract has ended where no one has tested positive and new people are moving in? Will this be at the owner's cost or the previous tenant's cost? So I don't know, Silna, do you maybe
very interesting
want to?
I've had this question a few times, Bruno, so I'm going to say what I've been telling, and then please tell me what you think. So I've had that question a few times, and my answer will be exactly the same for commercial, retail, industrial, and residential. So my answer is, if a tenant tested positive, that person's going to have to stay right there for 14 days. After that, that tenant has to be tested again, and he has to test negative before he can leave. That's the standard testing protocols, and that's the way it's working currently. If a tenant tested positive in a premises, definitely I would like to see sanitizing, and the lease agreement will pretty much gonna give us an indication on who's going to be responsible for the cost. What I'm saying, and I will get to the actual question which says tenant wasn't positive, I'll get there, I promise. But the lease agreement will give you an indication. The lease agreement will not refer to COVID-19, and the truth is I don't want lease agreements to refer to COVID-19. I've had, I think most people know I'm the drafting attorney of the TPN leaseback lease, and we've had a lot of discussions, but a lot of inquiries over the last 3 months where people asked us to amend the lease. And I am standing fast that I'm not going to change the agreement because I'm not going to cater for COVID-19. If the lease agreement can't cater for things outside of the eventualities that could happen in an agreement, we're making things too specific. And what happens if that is not a COVID problem, but now instead of COVID, it's something else. It's a war situation. I'm not saying anything because 2020 has years. Something else that is in place that happens. I'm not going to even talk about aliens, don't worry. But if something would happen, you need your contract always to be wide enough to cater for most instances. So why I've made reference to that is in the majority of lease agreements, it does deal with cleaning of the premises when the tenant vacates. So there's always an exit clean term. Well, I would like to see that. If there was, for instance, pets or somebody was allowed to smoke, the tenant will be responsible to bring the premises back to pre-smoking or pre-pet position. In most instances, the landlord and the tenant will do a joint cleaning situation. In practice, how it normally works is the tenant cleans the place as much as he can. The landlord sends a professional team or a friendly lady in to clean the place, and everybody is happy with that. Currently, I would like to see some increased product use, basically. We just want to see some alcohol in those products now. Who knew I would say something like this on a webinar, but yeah, it is now. So I would like to see some extra cleaning, and I think it is basically simply on agreement between the landlord and the tenant. And it doesn't have to be a new thing. It will already be in your lease agreement. If a lease agreement is silent on it, remember, as the landlord, you have an obligation to provide the new incoming tenant with a clean, healthy, safe environment to move into. That is the case, COVID or not. You can't let a tenant move into a place with dust. It's weird. We don't do that. That's not what good landlords do. So my recommendation is for the landlord to avoid running into a new lease agreement with a tenant already with some unpleasantries happening. I would suggest a full clean. It doesn't necessarily have to be a professional clean, but I would like to see everything sanitized, sprayed down with alcohol. I promise you, if you come and have coffee with me in my office, you will see how much alcohol I can spray over surfaces, and it's not really that expensive, and it's not really a big problem to do that. In a situation where a tenant tested positive, that's the situation. Where a tenant hasn't tested positive, we don't know if anybody is positive or not, really, unless they are testing. So I wouldn't handle this situation any differently, whether I know or not, just because when you do know a tenant tested positive, definitely I want to see a lot of cleaning. But in a normal situation where a tenant vacates the premises, I will just anyway keep it safe. Bruno, am I just being paranoid again?
Oh no, I absolutely agree with you. I'd even go so far as to maybe say that, again, looking at workplace comparisons, looking at the principles of returning a property in the same condition, which at the moment you're not actually sure whether you've contracted COVID or not, especially because of the incubation periods. We don't know how long the things are there for. So I go so far as to say, you know what, I would almost expect an exiting tenant to return the premises the same way that he got it, sanitized, right? Because sanitized or free of COVID, if you want to put it like that, because I gave it to you
Yeah.
free of COVID, I expect it back free of COVID, and I would expect you to pay for it, you as the exiting tenant. Whether it needs to be a professional deep clean, that might be pushing it. But I suppose that's a topic for debate, whether it needs to be professional, whether somebody with enough alcohol can go in there and spray the place clean. But
I'm
I
not
would go.
available for that, guys. I'm not offering my alcohol spray services.
Yeah, so I would definitely say exiting tenant. Insofar as landlord, so let's say tenant exits and doesn't do what he's supposed to do or can't prove that he did. Insofar as landlord is concerned, I would almost say that the incoming tenant would have an expectation to a certain degree for the premises to be safe. And as far as I'm concerned, unless you say that you've sanitized, or unless the property's been empty, don't get me wrong, if you've been sitting with an empty property for 14 days or 21 days, then I suppose it's okay, because by then everything's dead. But short of that, I would definitely impute a responsibility on a landlord to hand over a safe property. If a person gets sick after moving in, it's going to be very difficult to prove it was the premises, granted. So I don't see a lot of actions arising from that, but you don't want to take a chance. You don't want to take a chance of a person moving in and that's the only place they've been before they get a contract, because they may still blame you. And why do that? A good landlord, good reputation, keep your premises clean, and just sanitize.
I agree with you, Bruno. You said something very specific that I don't think I said that clearly. I like the way you said the difference between professional cleaning and just sanitizing. So the question was, who's going to be responsible for the cost of this? The cost can't possibly be that high unless the landlord decides that he specifically wants a professional clean. And to be honest, I can't see that unless there's a reason to have like everybody in like bee suits and like come in and clean everything, basically rip the carpets out, unless there's really a reason to do that, like somebody was positive in a place and they couldn't isolate there for some reason, and you need to move in less than 14 days. I can't see that we can put professional sanitization cost on an exiting tenant. Also, an incoming tenant can't expect professional sanitizing from a landlord. So the incoming tenant that wants professional cleaning, I believe that that is something that has to be dealt with in the new lease agreement, and the parties can agree on who's going to take that cost. They can share it. To be honest, I can't see that there's an obligation of over-the-top professional cleaning on a landlord. So in those cases, my recommendation is probably the parties must share those costs. And for that matter, an exiting tenant as well. Say, for instance, you did test positive and you need to vacate for some reason and you're going to go to the moon. Elon Musk invited you, so you're not going to place anybody else in danger. Whatever the situation is, in those cases, I would like to see also a shared cost between the landlord and the tenant. And I think all of this has to be done by agreement. I think everybody is wanting clear answers from the Rental Housing Act, but the Rental Housing Act doesn't know about COVID.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
All right, thank you for clarifying that. I think that is about the time that we have tonight. Any final thoughts from your side, Silva, Bruno?
Sure. Yeah. No, I'm good. I think things are getting better. I think the fear of COVID is subsiding. Whether that's a good or bad thing, I'm not sure yet. But the reality is business is continuing. People are realizing that, what, life has to go on. And yeah, we are actually dealing with it relatively well. There is still a lot of cooperation between people. So yeah, I have to just generally applaud most of my clients, most of the property sector, the practitioners. Everyone's doing their best. Everyone's doing well. I haven't seen any strange cases of, no, misunderstanding, yes, but of just outright blatant disregard for other human beings. Haven't really been dealing with those. So yeah, we're pretty happy.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, that's
Salma?
sort of mine as well. My initial ending comment would be, Bruno, will you please make me the host again? But that has nothing to do with anybody else. That was just an inside practicality.
That's what I was busy with earlier on. Okay, I'm doing it right now.
You can read my mind. But otherwise, we're going to be on Facebook and we're going to start talking about random stuff. But except for that, now I want to agree with you, Bruno. I think everybody is doing very well. I am very happy to see that most people are still are taking it seriously. I am concerned, however, that people are believing that with the restrictions being eased, that it is because COVID's gone. It's really gone nowhere. And the truth is, I almost want to really ask. I've said this a few times, but remember, whether you are in the oh my goodness, we need to take this seriously camp, or oh my soul, this is nothing more than a seasonal flu camp, that doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter which camp you are. What's important is if you were wrong and it's not just like it's more serious than you think, just consider the people around you. You can place yourself in harm's way, cool, everybody is allowed to do what they have to. But just consider the people around you. Consider the 5% chance that you in that camp and you are wrong, what the implications are. So as landlords, as tenants, as attorneys, as agents, as whatever, wherever you are and whatever you are doing, rather run around with the overly cautious situation in as far as you are in contact with other people. I think that's me and my Ubuntu conversations always. Consider everybody else around you. It's really not about you. And I think we do have an obligation, I know we have an obligation towards each other as human beings to appreciate the fact that life is not about you. And that there are a lot of people sharing this world and this planet with you, and just keep that in mind, and just consider that in every decision that you make, it makes most questions easier, right, Bruno? Like, do I sanitize or not? Rather play on safety's side.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
What would have, well, do unto others as you would want to have done unto yourself. Look at that, I'll be extremely deep tonight.
No, thank you so much. And thank you, Solna and Bruno, once again for this webinar. And then thank you everyone for joining us. Keep safe and warm, and then we'll see you next week.
Cool. Thanks, Marley.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.